For centuries, people understood that children often resemble their parents, yet no one truly knew how these traits were passed from one generation to the next. Farmers observed that certain plants produced better crops, and breeders noticed that animals could inherit particular features such as size, color, or strength. But the underlying rules behind inheritance remained unclear. Some believed traits simply blended together, like colors mixing into one another, while others thought inheritance followed patterns that had not yet been discovered. Hidden within this mystery was a quiet order waiting to be revealed. The man who would uncover that order was Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was born in 1822 in a small rural village called Heinzendorf, which is now part of the Czech Republic. His family were farmers, and from an early age he became familiar with the rhythms of agricultural life. The changing seasons, the planting and harvesting of crops, and the careful observation of plants were all part of his everyday experience. As a child, he helped his family in the fields, learning how different plants grew and how small changes in conditions could affect their development. Although his life began in a farming community, Mendel showed a strong interest in learning. He was a thoughtful and curious student, especially drawn to mathematics and science. His teachers recognized his ability and encouraged him to continue his education, even though his family faced financial challenges. With determination and support, he was able to attend school and eventually continue his studies beyond the village. As he grew older, Mendel joined an Augustinian monastery in the city of Brno. Life in the monastery offered him something very important: stability and access to education. The monastery was not only a religious center, but also a place where learning and scholarship were valued. It had a library, gardens, and connections to the broader intellectual community of Europe. Within the quiet environment of the monastery, Mendel found the opportunity to study deeply. He took courses in mathematics, physics, and natural science, developing the analytical skills that would later shape his research. He also became a teacher, instructing students in these subjects with patience and clarity. The monastery garden would soon become the setting for his most important work. Mendel became interested in understanding how traits are passed from one generation to the next. Plants provided a perfect subject for this kind of study because they could be grown in large numbers and carefully controlled. Among the many plants he could have chosen, Mendel selected the pea plant. The pea plant had several advantages. It grew relatively quickly, was easy to cultivate, and showed clear, distinct traits. Some pea plants produced round seeds, while others produced wrinkled ones. Some had yellow seeds, while others were green. The plants also differed in flower color, stem length, and pod shape. These clear differences made it possible to track how traits appeared in successive generations. Mendel began designing experiments with careful precision. He selected plants with specific traits and controlled how they were pollinated. By transferring pollen from one plant to another, he could ensure that only certain combinations of traits were passed on. He then observed the offspring, recording which traits appeared and in what proportions. These experiments required patience and consistency. Year after year, Mendel grew thousands of pea plants, carefully tracking their characteristics. He recorded his observations in detail, noting patterns that began to emerge as generations passed. At first, the results seemed surprising. When Mendel crossed plants with different traits, such as a plant with round seeds and one with wrinkled seeds, the first generation of offspring did not show a blend of both traits. Instead, all the offspring displayed only one of the traits. The other trait seemed to disappear, but it had not truly vanished. When Mendel allowed these offspring plants to reproduce, the hidden trait reappeared in the next generation. This pattern suggested that traits were not blending together as many people had believed. Instead, they were being passed on in a more structured way, sometimes remaining hidden for a generation before appearing again. Mendel realized that something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Through careful counting and analysis, he began to see that these traits followed specific numerical ratios. The appearance of traits in each generation was not random. It followed predictable patterns that could be described using mathematics. In the quiet garden of the monastery, surrounded by rows of pea plants, Gregor Mendel was uncovering the fundamental rules of inheritance, rules that would later become the foundation of genetics. As Gregor Mendel continued his experiments in the monastery garden, his work became more structured, more precise, and increasingly focused on uncovering the hidden rules behind inheritance. What began as simple observation slowly turned into a carefully designed scientific investigation. Mendel was not just growing plants. He was building a system to understand how traits pass from one generation to the next. He selected pea plants with very specific and clearly distinguishable traits. These included seed shape, which could be round or wrinkled, seed color, which could be yellow or green, flower color, which could be purple or white, and stem length, which could be tall or short. Each of these traits existed in two distinct forms, making them ideal for tracking inheritance. Mendel began by creating what are now known as pure breeding plants. These were plants that, when self-pollinated over several generations, consistently produced offspring with the same trait. For example, a pure round seed plant would always produce round seeds, and a pure wrinkled seed plant would always produce wrinkled seeds. Establishing these pure lines was an essential first step, because it ensured that the traits he was studying were stable and predictable. Once he had these pure plants, Mendel carefully controlled their reproduction. He would remove the pollen-producing parts of a flower to prevent self-pollination, and then transfer pollen from another plant by hand. This allowed him to decide exactly which plants would cross with each other. Each cross was planned and recorded with precision. When Mendel crossed two pure plants with different traits, such as round seeds and wrinkled seeds, the results were immediate and clear. In the first generation, which he carefully observed and documented, all the offspring displayed only one of the traits. In this case, all the seeds were round. The wrinkled trait seemed to have disappeared entirely. This result was unexpected. At the time, many scientists believed in the idea of blending inheritance, where traits from parents would mix together in the offspring. If that were true, Mendel should have observed seeds that were somewhere between round and wrinkled. Instead, he saw only one clear form. Rather than dismissing this result, Mendel continued the experiment. He allowed the first-generation plants to self-pollinate and produce a second generation. When these plants produced seeds, something remarkable happened. The wrinkled trait reappeared, not in equal numbers, but in a consistent ratio. For approximately every 3 round seeds, there was 1 wrinkled seed. Mendel repeated this experiment many times, using different traits and large numbers of plants. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. One trait would dominate in the first generation, and then in the next generation, the hidden trait would return in a predictable proportion. From these observations, Mendel began forming a new idea. He proposed that traits are controlled by discrete units, which are passed from parents to offspring. These units do not blend together. Instead, each parent contributes 1 unit for each trait. In the offspring, these units can interact in different ways. One unit may dominate the other, determining which trait is visible, while the other remains present but hidden. Mendel called these units factors. Today they're known as genes. He described the visible trait as dominant and the hidden one as recessive. In the case of round and wrinkled seeds, round was dominant, meaning it would appear whenever at least one factor for roundness was present. Wrinkled was recessive, meaning it would only appear when both factors were for wrinkled seeds. This idea explained the patterns he observed. When 2 pure plants were crossed, each contributed 1 factor. All the first-generation plants received 1 dominant and 1 recessive factor, so they all appeared the same. But when these plants reproduced, the factors separated and recombined in different ways, producing the 3-to-1 ratio Mendel consistently observed. Mendel did not stop with single traits. He expanded his experiments to study how multiple traits were inherited at the same time. For example, he crossed plants that differed in both seed shape and seed color. By carefully analyzing the results, he discovered that these traits were inherited independently of one another. The inheritance of seed shape did not affect the inheritance of seed color. This led to another important principle. which would later be called the law of independent assortment. To reach these conclusions, Mendel relied heavily on mathematics. He counted thousands of plants and analyzed the results using numerical ratios. This approach was unusual at the time, as many scientists relied more on descriptive observation than precise measurement. Mendel's use of numbers allowed him to see patterns that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. His work required extraordinary patience. Over the course of about 8 years, he grew and studied more than 20,000 pea plants. Each plant represented a small piece of evidence, and together they formed a clear and consistent picture of how inheritance works. In the quiet garden of the monastery, with rows of carefully tended plants and notebooks filled with observations, Mendel was uncovering laws that would later become the foundation of modern genetics. Even though at the time, very few people yet understood the importance of what he had discovered. As Gregor Mendel's experiments continued over many years, the patterns he observed became clearer and more consistent. What began as a careful study of pea plants gradually turned into a complete system that explained how traits are passed from parents to offspring. By the time he finished his work, Mendel had uncovered several fundamental principles that described inheritance with a level of precision that had never been achieved before. After gathering large amounts of data, Mendel organized his findings into a set of clear ideas. One of his most important insights was that the factors controlling traits always occur in pairs within each organism. One factor is inherited from the mother and the other from the father. These paired factors remain separate from each other rather than blending together, and they can be passed on to the next generation in different combinations. This idea led to what is now called the law of segregation. Mendel observed that when organisms produce reproductive cells, the paired factors separate so that each cell carries only one factor for each trait. When fertilization occurs, the offspring receives one factor from each parent, restoring the pair. This process explains why traits can disappear in one generation and reappear in the next. A recessive trait may remain hidden when paired with a dominant one, but it can still be passed on and expressed later if the right combination occurs. Mendel also explored how different traits are inherited together. By studying plants that differed in more than one characteristic, such as seed color and seed shape, he noticed that these traits did not always travel together as a fixed group. Instead, they were combined in new ways in each generation. For example, when he crossed plants with round yellow seeds and plants with wrinkled green seeds, the offspring in later generations showed a variety of combinations. Some had round yellow seeds, others had round green seeds, some had wrinkled yellow seeds, and others had wrinkled green seeds. These combinations appeared in predictable ratios, suggesting that each trait was inherited independently. This observation led to what became known as the law of independent assortment. According to this principle, the factors for different traits are distributed to offspring independently of one another. This allows for a wide variety of combinations, which explains the diversity seen within species. It also means that inheritance is not a simple copying process, but a dynamic system where traits can mix and reappear in new ways over generations. Mendel carefully documented all of these results and eventually prepared a detailed report of his work. In 1866, he published his findings in a scientific paper titled Experiments on Plant Hybridization. In this paper, he described his methods, presented his data, and explained the mathematical patterns he had discovered. The paper was clear and precise, filled with numerical results and logical reasoning. Mendel had essentially created a new scientific approach to studying inheritance, combining observation, experimentation, and mathematics into a single framework. Yet despite the importance of his work, it received very little attention at the time. There were several reasons for this. Mendel published his paper in a relatively small scientific journal that was not widely read outside his region. In addition, many scientists of the time were not accustomed to using mathematics in biological studies, making his conclusions difficult for some to fully understand or appreciate. Perhaps most importantly, the broader scientific community was not yet ready for Mendel's ideas. The concept of discrete units of inheritance, what we now call genes, was very different from the widely accepted belief in blending inheritance. Without knowledge of cells, chromosomes, or DNA, there was no clear physical explanation for the factors Mendel described. As a result, his work remained largely unnoticed. Mendel himself did not aggressively promote his discoveries. He was a quiet and modest man, more interested in careful study than in seeking recognition. After completing his experiments, he gradually shifted his attention to other responsibilities within the monastery. In 1868, he became the abbot, or leader, of the monastery, which required him to take on administrative duties that limited the time he could devote to scientific research. Even though his groundbreaking work on inheritance did not gain immediate recognition, Mendel continued to believe in the importance of careful observation and logical reasoning. The notebooks filled with his experiments remained as a record of his dedication and patience. Unknown to him, the principles he had discovered would one day become the foundation of an entirely new field of science, reshaping our understanding of life itself. As Gregor Mendel moved into the later years of his life, his role within the monastery began to change significantly. In 1868, he was elected abbot of the Augustinian monastery in Brno. This position brought him respect and authority, but also came with heavy responsibilities. He was now in charge of managing the monastery's affairs, overseeing finances, dealing with administrative decisions, and representing the institution in wider political and social matters. These duties gradually took up most of his time, leaving him with far fewer opportunities to continue his scientific experiments. The quiet garden, where he had once spent years patiently studying pea plants, became less central to his daily life. The careful crossing of plants, the counting of seeds, and the recording of numerical patterns gave way to meetings, correspondence, and organizational work. Although he still held an interest in science, the intense period of experimentation that had led to his discoveries had largely come to an end. During these years, Mendel also faced ongoing challenges. One of the most significant involved disputes with government authorities over taxation policies imposed on religious institutions. Mendel strongly resisted these measures, believing they were unfair to the monastery. The disagreement became a long and difficult conflict, requiring time and energy that might otherwise have been devoted to research or study. These struggles added a layer of stress to his later life, contrasting with the quiet focus that had characterized his earlier years in the garden. Despite the importance of his scientific work, Mendel did not receive recognition for his discoveries during his lifetime. His 1866 paper, Experiments on Plant Hybridization, remained largely unnoticed by the broader scientific community. Only a small number of scientists read it, and even fewer fully understood its significance. The ideas he had presented were ahead of their time, and without a clear biological framework to support them, they were difficult for others to accept. At the time, scientists still did not understand the physical basis of inheritance. Cells have been observed under microscopes, but their internal structures were not yet fully understood. Chromosomes had not yet been identified as carriers of genetic information, and the concept of DNA was still far in the future. Without this knowledge, Mendel's factors remained abstract, powerful in their predictive ability, but lacking of visible explanation. As a result, his work quietly faded into obscurity. Gregor Mendel died in 1884 at the age of 61. At the time of his death, he was remembered primarily as a respected abbot and teacher rather than as a scientist who had uncovered fundamental laws of nature. The notebooks filled with his experiments and the paper he had published remained largely forgotten, stored away without drawing significant attention. Yet the story of Mendel's work did not end there. In the early 20th century, more than 3 decades after his death, several scientists working independently began studying patterns of inheritance in plants. As they conducted their experiments and analyzed their results, they noticed striking similarities to the patterns Mendel had described. While searching through earlier scientific literature, they rediscovered Mendel's 1866 paper. What they found was remarkable. Mendel had already described the exact principles they were observing. His laws of segregation and independent assortment explain the patterns of inheritance they were seeing in their own experiments. His mathematical approach, once overlooked, now appeared as a clear and powerful explanation of how traits are passed from one generation to the next. This rediscovery brought Mendel's work into the center of scientific attention. Scientists began building upon his ideas, connecting them with new discoveries in cell biology. They identified chromosomes as the structures that carry genetic information, and later research revealed the role of DNA as the molecule responsible for inheritance. Mendel's factors were now understood as genes, physical units located on chromosomes that determine traits. With this new understanding, Mendel came to be recognized as the founder of modern genetics. His simple experiments with pea plants had uncovered principles that apply to all living organisms. From plants and animals to humans, the basic rules governing inheritance follow the patterns he described. His work made it possible to understand how traits are passed down, how variation occurs, and how species evolve over time. Today, genetics is one of the most important fields in science and medicine. It influences agriculture, allowing scientists to develop crops that are more productive and resistant to disease. It shapes medicine, helping researchers understand genetic disorders and develop treatments tailored to individual patients. It even plays a role in understanding the history of life on Earth, tracing how species have changed and adapted over millions of years. All of this traces back to the quiet work of Gregor Mendel in a monastery garden. His life shows how careful observation, patience, and logical thinking can reveal profound truths about the natural world. Without advanced technology, without recognition, and without a large research institution, he uncovered the basic laws of inheritance simply by studying patterns and trusting the evidence he observed. What seemed like a small and modest set of experiments with pea plants became one of the most important scientific breakthroughs in history. Through his work, Mendel transformed the mystery of inheritance into a clear and understandable system, opening the door to a deeper understanding of life itself.